Ivan. Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you in this room and all of you around the world watching on BGC TV. For those of you who are watching, there's always the possibility of tweeting in your questions at some point. We'll check the iPad to see if any have arrived. The hashtag on the screen there and on your screens at home. Tonight's lecture inaugurates this year's IRIS season, the annual awards that the Bard Graduate Center presents to an array of patrons and scholars whose commitment to the fields of decorative arts, design history, and material culture we feel merits attention and honor. Our speaker tonight, Giorgio Riello, has been awarded by the faculty the Mid-Career Award. And we always struggle to define what constitutes mid-career. If you stop to think about it for a while, it's an interesting category, but one that is very difficult to pin down precisely. Some of the previous winners of the award, just to help you towards a definition, include Nicholas Thomas, Barry Flood, Lisa Lagama, Danny Miller, Barry Bergdahl, Evelyn Welch, and Craig Clunas, among a long list by now. What all of these people had in common, I now realize, and I realized it, in fact, only as I worked my way through tonight's speaker's CV in trying to prepare this introduction. What they all have in common is a CV worthy of someone 20 years their age. Tonight's speaker, Giorgio Riello, is professor of global history and culture at the University of Warwick and is director of the Institute of Advanced Study at Warwick. He was previously the co-director of the Global History and Culture Center, which he is taking on again extraordinarily next year. His PhD is in history from University College London. His dissertation was entitled The Boot and Shoe Trade in London and Paris in the Long 18th Century. And this dissertation gave him leg up, I suppose, in his, couldn't resist, there had to be a pun. A Foot in the Past was the title of the book, Consumers, Producers, and Footwear in the Long 18th Century, published by Oxford in 2006. It's the first of 3 monographs that he has published. The second was Cotton, the Fabric That Made the Modern World, published by Cambridge in 2013. And the next one to be out next week, but not here in this country, in the UK, Luxury, A Rich History, again with Oxford. So these are the monographs, the towering achievements we might say, but they are surrounded like megaliths in a field by other, only somewhat smaller, large monuments to the collaborative projects that he is so committed to. The Global Lives of Things, the material culture of connections in the first global age, which has just been published by Routledge. Writing Material Culture History, published last year by Bloomsbury. Both of these edited with Anne Gerritsen, his colleague at Warwick, who spoke right here last week. The book on cotton was reviewed widely in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and was the winner of the Bentley Prize in 2014 of the World History Association. And in addition to these 14 books and edited collections, there's a whole host of articles, chapters, essays, prefaces on a range of subjects: textiles, dress, luxury, global history, and of course, material culture. As is really our practice here at the Bard Graduate Center, the scholarship that we honor and the scholarship that we publish in our various catalogs, monographs, and journals, and the lecturers we invite to come and speak here from the podium or sitting around the table, all represent the kind of scholarship that we admire and the kind of scholarship that we view as cognate. People doing the kind of work we do, interested in the same kinds of questions we do, wherever they may be. And we invite them here not only to learn about the things they have discovered, the research they have done, but also to learn from how they do it and the way they have, in fact, as our speaker has so well, made these subjects important on a global stage. It's a pleasure for me to invite Giorgio Riello to the podium.
Thank you so much for the very kind words and very kind invitation. I'm terribly sorry that my voice is a bit low, so I'll try to speak up as much as I can. I have a bit of a cold. Um, I would like to start actually not from the early modern period, the period from 1400 to 1800, but my starting point will be just 3 years ago. It was January 29th, 2013, when at Christie's here in New York, a modest 9 by 11 inches print was auctioned. It was estimated to be valued between $100,000 and $150,000, and it was sold for a staggering $866,500, the highest ever price achieved by a German Renaissance print. It was, of course, not an ordinary print in any sense, but one of the famous rhinoceros prints produced by the artist Albrecht Dürer 5 centuries earlier in 1515. The commotion caused in New York, in the New York art market on the cold January day 3 years ago, was nothing compared to the uproar of the real rhinoceros when it arrived at the port of Lisbon on the 1st of May 1515. This was the first animal of its kind to be seen in Europe since antiquity. People flocked to see the strange creature, a gift from Sultan Muzaffar of Cambay to King Manuel I of Portugal. To verify the reports of ancient Greek and Roman writers that rhinoceros could overcome large animals, a duel with an elephant was hastily organized. The elephant fled upon seeing the mighty rhino. The presence of rhinoceros in Lisbon in the early 16th century should not surprise us. European traders, travelers, and adventurers had been exploring the Atlantic and the coast of Africa for nearly a century. The breakthrough came in the 1490s when first Columbus and later da Gama, just 6 years later, reached the Americas and India respectively. These voyages inaugurated what was once defined as the age of exploration, better to say the age of European exploration, or the age of European expansion, a new era for the continent, leading to changing commercial, political, and cultural relationships with the rest of the world. And such voyages open up a number of material relationships with other continents that brought to Europe a variety of new and strange things, such as exotic animals, specimens, and stones, as well as new plants, woods, and manufactured commodities. This came to change the material landscape of Europe, and historians now argue also its political and economic trajectory. For it must be said that the relationship between Europe and Asia and other continents predated the direct trade instituted especially by the European East India Company after 1500 and during the course of the 17th century. Dürer's print, however, opens up a problem of perspective for us. The animal that it represented was very much a unique living artifact. Indeed, it remained alive only for a short time. After the novelty was over, the Catholic King of Portugal thought it a suitable present for Pope Leo X and sent it to Rome. The animal was therefore gifted twice between rulers, a sign of the prestige of such an exotic object. Alas, the unfortunate animal never arrived, as the ship that carried it sunk in the Mediterranean. Yet its lasting fame was ensured through a drawing and eventually the print that you saw earlier. Dürer, of course, was based in Germany, in Nuremberg, at the time and never saw the animal. However, he received a verbal report and a sketch from a printmaker who had been in Lisbon and had drawn the original animal. The result is a print that looks very unlike a real rhinoceros. And here I quote the cartouche. It has the color of a speckled turtle, and it is almost entirely covered by a thick shell. So there's the cartouche on Dura's print. The artist also added an extra horn that you can see perhaps better in the previous one. Through this print, the rhino was not just modified, it was also commodified. It is estimated that around 4,000 to 5,000 prints were produced during Dura's lifetime. If you want, it was a true bestseller by 16th century standards that made actually the artist quite rich. He didn't make much money with painting, but he did a lot of money with this. It must be said that because of the ephemeral nature of the animal, it must be said that because of the ephemeral nature of the prints, very few impressions from the first edition survive, thus explaining the high price paid for the prints sold at Christie's. Another 7 editions, such as this one of 1550, were printed in the 2 decades after Dura's death in 1528. However, if no one had a real rhino in Europe, it took another 60 years to get another one to the continent. Thousands could at least enjoy a representation of the animal on their walls, or as in this case, as part of an album. The real animal and its 2-dimensional representations are also indicative of a split in the scholarship concerning Europe's early modern material transformation brought about by new geographical horizons, the horizons of global trade, in what has been defined as the first global age. On the one hand, the last decade has seen a thriving series of studies on what might be called unique objects, artifacts whose material beauty, exceptional value, or imaginative power make them suitable to encompass an entire world of material change and exchange. The British Museum well-known series, A History of the World in 100 Objects, that indeed included also the rhino's print, is a good example of telling a complex story through the lens and perspective of 100 carefully chosen objects that spark the imagination and capture complex narratives of trade, encounter, diplomacy, and so on. This methodology has been and continues to be deployed especially in museum displays and exhibition, where we are often presenting with extraordinary rather than ordinary objects, not just because of their potency of meaning, but because they are well documented, have been treasured over the centuries, and therefore have reached us unscathed. In the case of the rhino, the animal itself perished a long time ago, and its role of unique object has been taken by its printed representation as confirmed by the enormous price paid for it. Yet rhino prints were in the 16th century far from unique objects. Quite the opposite. They belonged instead to the realm of traded commodities, a further categories that have received a great deal of attention in material culture studies at a global level. Here the focus is not on unique objects, but on goods that became part of consuming habits, sometimes of millions of Europeans, such as small Chinese cups or cheap Indian printed textiles. Differently from unique objects, that emphasize encounters between cultures, the analysis of global commodities have underlined instead commerce and trade between different parts of the world. Whilst the stories told through unique objects are often linked to the collecting practices of the elites, those considering traded goods focus instead on the consumption patterns of common people. This division between unique objects and global commodities is not as neat as it might appear. although it captures the different role played by artifacts themselves. An influential exhibition such as Encounters, the meeting of Asian and Europe, 1500 to 1800, held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2004, provided a template for the use of artifacts to tell global narratives based mostly on the trade of artistic objects and luxuries, with the inclusion of more mundane items. This approach has been carefully adopted by further successful exhibition, both intellectually and in terms of viewing public. And here I would like to mention a couple, the Interwoven Globe, just 3 years ago at the Met, and the above mentioned British Museum History of the World series, if you want, although it was not an exhibition, activities such as the refurbishment of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the new ceramic galleries and European galleries at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the forthcoming expansion of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, not to say the recent exhibition Asian in Amsterdam that was at the Rijksmuseum and is now the Peabody Essex. So you see a variety of activities around the museum world. Historians prefer instead to start with documents to study the role of material change brought about by America and Asia. For instance, they consider inventories listing new and exotic objects. The work of Anne McCants has done much to quantify the penetration of Asian goods into the consuming habits of Europeans, as has the research and exhibition here at the Bard on the inventory of Margarita van Warwick, who died in present-day Brooklyn in 1697 after spending part of her life in Europe, in Malacca, and then in Dutch New York. My colleague Maxime Berg and British historian and Iris Prize holder John Stiles consider instead not just the role of Asian commodities and their usage in Europe, but also their technological impact, for instance, in terms of transposition of forms into new materials, such as the relationship between silver and porcelain, and the issues of imitation of technology, and indeed transmission of techniques such as porcelain production in Europe, not to say the imitation of lacquer or the imitation of printed textiles. The issue of imitation of Asian goods and their familiarization as part of existing European taste and consumer pattern has led to further research on the ways in which such objects were traded, sold, and made part of European interiors and personal and fashionable choices. And this agenda has focused not on the artifacts per se, but on broad object types and their consumption. It has often adopted nuanced anthropological methodologies that allow understanding the value and meaning of those objects beyond the mere quantification or the investigation of trade routes. In turn, this scholarship has influenced studies of other world areas, and here I give you a sense of the scholarship that has been produced recently, such as the work of Greg Clunas, mentioned earlier, and Anna Gerritsen for China, but also the work of the late Donald Quartet and Suraya Farocki for the Ottoman Empire, not to say for Latin America and North America, for Africa, and in particular there the work of Jeremy Presthold. So the question is, how important was the contribution of non-European objects in transforming the material life of Europe and North America in the period from the 16th to the 18th centuries? This is a very simple, but actually a very difficult question, because it bears different answers. If I wanted to convince you that Asian commodities were very important, I could mention, and here I put the only figure I have, millions of pieces of cotton textiles imported from by the English, French, and Dutch East India companies to Europe over the course of the 17th and 18th century. And these come from India. And you can see that essentially over a period of roughly 5 years, you could have 1 million later on 1.5 million pieces of textiles, each of which is about 35 yards long. So it seems quite a lot. Yet it has been estimated that at the height of the early modern global trade in the 18th century, no more than 1 to 2% of everything that was consumed in Europe came from outside the continent. Quantities are, however, deceiving, as they do not necessarily capture the cultural impact of such commodities and artifacts, and the subtle ways in which European material culture, living standards, and even, if you want, local traditions, that is this case of the use of Indian textiles in traditional folk, you might say folk dress of the Netherlands, impacted what you might want to call material life, to use the expression of Fernand Braudel, the material life of the more or less 100 million inhabitants of the Western world in the mid-18th century. Let us consider, for instance, this painting, very dark, I'm sorry, by the Dutch artist Peter de Hoek, entitled Leisure Time in an Elegant Setting, that was painted between 1663 and 1665 and is now just across the park. It shows a wealthy family, possibly a mother and a father with their 2 children. The scene is not so different from the many domestic scenes painted by Vermeer, Metsu, Frans Hals, and other painters of the Dutch Golden Age. It shows expensive gilded leather panels on the walls, a Dutch cabinet in the middle of the room, as well as large and small canvases on the walls. A costly carpet that you can see there in the middle in red has pride of place as a table covering. Pile carpet like these were produced in Anatolia and used as floor coverings in the Middle East. From the mid-15th century, they started to be imported into Europe, frequently appearing in Italian Renaissance and North European paintings. In Europe, however, they were used as table rather than floor covering. They were expensive, and therefore, like many other Asian commodities, they were made to fit European furniture and European taste. This is the case of the carpet in this painting, characterized by a composite blossom with sprays of flowers, curling leaves, and that appealed very much to European taste. Now, Turkish carpets, here you can see it a bit better, are representative of the many types of goods imported into Europe in the 17th century. They were neither exclusive rarities, as for instance a Persian carpet might have been, nor commodities at the reach of everyone. They were instead perceived as novel objects that people aspired to possess. The fact that they are painted does not necessarily mean that they were actually to be found in households. There are clever strategies at play. We know, for instance, that in 1645, the Amsterdam merchant Nicolaas Piliers rented a Turkish carpet so that it could be included in a portrait of himself. Once again, the power and pleasure of imagination, for instance through paintings, serve to amplify the cultural value and presence of Asian objects. So much so that the categorization of Turkish carpets is still based on the names of the painters that represented them, thus Lotto carpets, often visible in paintings of the Renaissance by Lorenzo Lotto, and used also by Dutch artists like De Hoek, but also Bellini carpets, Holbein carpets, and so on. Consumer goods imported from Asia were not the only type of objects born out of the new global connections and the horizons of the early modern period. There were also objects of collecting and wonder, especially imported in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were often arranged into cabinets, the Kunstkammer, and included large shells like Nautilus cups, specimens of stones, stuffed animals, antiquities and relics, as was the case of the very famous collection of the Danish doctor and natural philosopher Ole Worm in the mid-17th century. The work of Pamela Smith, Paula Finland, Ben Smith, and others has alerted us that there were also objects of knowledge in important proto-ethnographic collections, such that the Tradescant collection, now at the Ashmolean Museum, and possibly you can see there Hester showing off a beautiful calico gown, possibly from India, but the same could be said about the original nucleus of the British Museum coming from the Sloane collection. A third group of artifacts were objects of diplomacy and luxury that were the subject of a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago here in New York at Columbia. They included many gifts exchanged between Asian and European rulers as part of diplomatic relations, such as fine porcelain, portraits, and precious textiles, and luxuries such as Indian diamonds, American emeralds, and of course African gold and American silver that formed the majority of the silverware that was used by Europeans in the early modern period. And finally, in terms of the category of goods that were traded and exchanged, one should not forget food, animals, and plants, ranging from the potato to pineapples, from turkeys to tomatoes. A more transient variety of material culture that had a profound effect on European everyday life. This functional classification should not be interpreted as exclusive. Some objects, like the rhino, belong to all categories, an animal that was used as a diplomatic gift, but was also an object of knowledge and collecting, and through a print became an object of wide consumption. However, this division into categories remains a useful way of understanding the different function that extra-European objects had in Europe in the early modern period. This category shows the variety of things that enter into Europe. All of these artifacts, in different ways, are materialization of the connections that characterize the early modern world. Yet, the early modern world allows us to be critical of certain present-day social science theories that see global connectivity as key to what we call globalization. Clearly, material culture was one of the ways in which economic, social, and cultural ties between different parts of the world took shape. But what is often referred to as the first global age, the intensification of global trade and exchange in the period between the 15th and the 18th century, can be used as a tool to critically assess easy ideas of world connectivity today. The first global age was not the same of today's globalization. Early modernity was not a global village. It was not one of global products with semiotic power such as the brands today. It was not homogeneous. It was not flat. In fact, something that can be argued against even for today in terms of globalization. It was surely not a world of instantaneity, as it took the best of 2 years, if you were lucky, of course, to survive the journey, to move from China to the port of New Amsterdam. Very few individuals lived lives across cultural boundaries, and this is why we single them out, because they left diaries of their travels and their residence in different parts of the world, as in the case of as we've seen earlier, of Margaretha van Warwick. The premise for an argument about the connectedness of the world in the pre-modern period seems to be slight, and with it, I'm sorry to say, the chances of my paper to live to the expectation of its title. This paper singles out Europe and North America and takes material culture to be one of the ways in which the world became connected and Westerners became more integrated in a world in which they had been actually quite marginal for a very long time. Material culture, however, helps us also to give a qualitative dimension to the very meaning of connectivity. What does it mean to be connected? And it's not just a matter to be more connected, but also to think about how one is connected, and also about one is to imagine the world surrounding him or herself. So I do not wish to be exhaustive, surely I do not wish to exhaust my audience, but so I will try to limit myself to showing you some of the ways in which global historians might approach the theme of early modern connections through material culture. The first approach is to consider a single space, such as a house or a city or a nation, and examine the ways in which commodities and artifacts perceived as foreign influence the social, economic, and cultural standing of the people living in such a place. So let us go back to our painting, very dark painting, Leisure Time in an Elegant Setting. A closer look to this painting reveals that the fine Turkish carpet is not the only exotic objects in the picture. One can see on top of the cabinet 2 bowls of Chinese ceramics, perhaps as Stiles and Burke would say, now you might see or not see anything, possibly Delftware imitations of blue and white Chinese porcelain. The father is holding a pipe, you see a bit better, and therefore consuming tobacco from the West Indies, as he holds he's holding in his hand also a traditional Dutch beaver hat, whose materials come, of course, from present-day Canada. It is also likely that the metal objects on the table, there you can see them, are made of American silver. All of these objects, as Tim Brooks observed in his bestseller Vermeer's Hat, are not unintended. They provided contemporary viewers with the idea that this was no common family, but one connected with all corners of the world, at least the corners of the world that the Dutch had reached by the mid-17th century. This was a cosmopolitan interior, and the concept of cosmopolitanism has been used to identify people and places that enjoyed a high degree of connectivity in the early modern period. Amsterdam was not unique. Cities like Venice, but also Mexico City or Suzhou in China, were equally cosmopolitan, and a variety of artifacts and commodities gave body to the financial, economic, and cultural connections that these places entertain with many parts of the world. Like today's world financial centers, these global cities of early modernity were places where keynotes in the articulation of a system. But in this case, the system was based on material artifacts that travel over long distances. A second, a complementary approach, is to consider yet again a specific place, but read global connection not through objects coming from different parts of the world, but through the lens of external ideas and influences that shape their material culture. Food is a good example. As specific dishes and foodstuff, often coming from faraway places, are adopted, reinterpreted, and sometimes made local as part of local cuisine, eating habits, and traditions. Chinese food, as in this case I like the name of this Chinese restaurant called New World, is not necessarily food or dishes from China. It includes instead preparation and cooking methods and categories of food that are at least perceived as Chinese or passed off as such. When we go to a Chinese restaurant, everything might be locally sourced, yet the result is distinctively foreign. There is no actual movement of anything material, but the movement of ideas, and in this case, in the case of material culture, it might be the movement of design, techniques of production, and decoration, aesthetic principles, and so on. So let me go back to our early modern period with an object that is much more splendid. This screen is an example that brings together our food similitude and a striking object. It was produced in the middle of the 17th century, and it is distinctively Japanese, with its golden background, subtle motif, and the use of a light material such as paper. It is not, strictly speaking, a global object because, unlike the so-called Namban screens representing European groups of traders, this type of screen was produced for consumption internal to Japan. The object is global in a different way. It represents two plants, as you can see there. Coxcombs, that is native to Japan, and maize that is instead imported by the Portuguese after their arrival in Japan in 1543. The artist decided to create a composition that mixed domestic and foreign, with the curl alien maize lazily bent, while the bright red stalks of the native coxcombs stands erect. Clearly, Japanese artists were keen to expand their repertoire to include new and exotic subjects. In this case, a crop like maize that came from the Americas and spread to Europe in the first decades of the 16th century, reaching China and Japan as early as 1550. An object like this tells us a great deal about global connections and how the so-called Columbian exchange, that is the exchange of food, animals, crops, and illnesses between the Americas and Eurasia, came to affect places such as Japan relatively quickly in the 16th century, and indeed not just places and consuming habits, but also artistic expressions. Complementary to ideas of cosmopolitanism created by the bringing together of objects from different parts of the world, historians consider hybridity in the coming together of different ideas, techniques, and values as materialized in objects, often of local manufacture. A great deal of material culture, of the material culture of Latin America in the 17th and 18th century shows the influence not just of Spain and Portugal, who colonized much of the continent in this period, but also pre-Columbian tradition, as well as influences coming from China, a place that supplies many silks and porcelains to Latin American consumers, and from India that supplies a variety of cotton fabrics. Furniture, ceramics, and textiles of local production blended the aesthetic, technical, and artistic languages of all of these different places, creating new meaning for objects and new hybrid identity for their owners. This is the case of the so-called Puebla jug that you see here, considered by a number of scholars, that was produced in the city of Puebla in circa 1700, thanks to the introduction of tin glazing technology to Mexico in the early 16th century by Spanish potters. Initially, Mexican tin glazed ceramics were strongly influenced by Spanish Mayolica pottery. However, after the opening of the Manila to Acapulco routes in the 1560s, Chinese porcelain came to strongly influence local potters who combined Chinese blue and white decorative schemes with uniquely Mexican design, such as the distinctive bird motif that you see there. The previous examples consider artifacts from a static point of view, as if standing in a specific place. Two further ways of considering connections emphasize instead the dynamic movement of objects. Both approaches, static and dynamic, normally assume that material things are produced in a certain place and moved to another, like for instance in the case of a piece of porcelain produced in Japan and traded to Europe, where it was purchased for domestic use. And this is the case. But this second piece of ceramic, that as you can see is a tankard, is an object that defies such an easy categorization. It is instead a piece of porcelain produced in Japan and traded to Europe in the 17th century. Yet it is not necessarily an object that we can classify as Japanese, as it is also Chinese, Dutch, and German at the same time. The porcelain part of the tankard was actually produced in Arita, in Japan, in imitation of Chinese blue and white porcelain. Arita was, from the middle of the 17th century, a place where porcelain was made for export to Europe. The tankard is European in shape, and the decoration of figures in a landscape was probably drawn by a Japanese artist following a Dutch design after a Chinese original. Once it reached Europe, a silver gilt mount was added. This also includes a coin commemorating John Ernest, the Duke of Weimar, that was struck in 1616 and was punched with the date of 1664, the year the silver mount was possibly applied. Cases like the Japanese tankard are not as rare as we might think. Martha Eimer and Luca Mola, in an essay published in the book that was mentioned earlier, Global Design History, that I co-edited with Glenn Adamson, consider the famous Molino Yua, a brass artifact with what you might call a multi-layered biography. From a manufacturing point of view, this is a Northern European object, possibly made in the Flanders or in Germany in the second half of the 15th century. But its decoration is distinctively Islamic and was possibly carried out the decoration in Syria or Egypt. After being decorated, it was sent to Italy, where the Molino family coat of arms was applied. To conclude its long biography today, the object is, of course, in a British museum. One can talk about global biographies of things and consider the entanglements of places to be seen through the materiality of the objects. In the same ways in which economists follow commodity chains, for instance, from coffee beans cultivated in plantations in South America to espresso in a Parisian cafe, one can talk about artifacts chains to consider instead the ways in which objects take shape in space by drawing on a long-distance trade of raw materials, by relying on design patterns provided by consumers' markets, by being decorated, customized, and modified in different places and in different times. The final dynamic approach that I wish to consider reflects instead one object type and many places that he reached. This allows us to see how artifacts connected different places, and those objects that reached Europe might not be as exceptional as we might think. And here I go to my own interest in cotton textiles. As I said earlier, one of the commodities much craved by Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries were cotton textiles produced in Gujarat or on the Malabar and Coromandel coast of India. These were the bulk of the trade conducted by the European East India companies between Asia and Europe, accounting for up to 70% of all traded commodities that reached London or Amsterdam from India. Calicos and chintzes and other Indian cottons were commodities with widespread appeal that, as the scholarship of Yale curator Ruth Barnes shows, were widely traded well beyond the borders of the Indian Ocean before the arrival of European ships at the beginning of the 16th century. If we follow an object rather than predefined spaces, for instance, Europe or North America as possible destinations, we realize that Europeans actually started appreciating Indian cotton textiles rather late. Calicos, chintzes, and striped and checkered fabrics had made inroads into the consuming habits of most of Asia well before 1500. In the 16th and 17th century, in 16th and 17th century Japan, for instance, Indian cotton textiles were as popular as they were in Europe. We see them here in the shape of, this is unintended, in the shape of Bengara jima, the striped and checked cloth from Bengal, Santome jima, the striped cloth from Sao Tome, or matafujima, the striped cloth from Madras, worn by the Portuguese arriving in Japan in the early 16th century. The Portuguese might have been barbarians, the Tamban, the barbarians from the West, but they were also what I define the coolest guys at the early modern period, as they wore bright and colorful striped and checkered trousers that became instantly fashionable in Japan. Visual and documentary sources and the analysis of some rare extant examples show that cheap Indian checks and fabrics and striped fabrics were also popular among West African consumers, as you can see here. European manufacturers in the 18th century started imitating these Indian fabrics in mixed linen cotton to export them to Africa. Because of the millions of Africans and slaves to work on the American plantations, Indian cotton stripes and checks, again, this has become automatic, became one of the most common fabrics in the West Indies and Brazil, and later in the plantation of the US, so much so that you have the bandana, another Indian type of cloth, that becomes one of the distinctive ways in which the Far West is defined. And you can see John Wayne actually wearing one of these bandanas. Three issues should be underlined. First, the fact that the use of one object type and how it moves through space allows us to relativize the European experience, showing how the continent was just one part of a bigger story. Second, it alerts us to the fact that the global movement of goods was not necessarily towards Europe. Sometimes Europe acted as a vehicle to trade Asian goods to the Americas. And finally, fluxes of goods went in the opposite direction, from Europe to Asia. And in the case of, for instance, automatic clock or mirrors, from Europe to Asia in the sense of the widespread appeal of this type of commodities in places like China. Now, our walk through the ways in which we might interpret how material culture contributed to the connectivity of the first global age should not forget that similarity and differences were also important in the past as they are today. Part of our ways of articulating alterity and otherness is the result of implicit and explicit comparisons that we carried out constantly. You have been clapping tonight, and I promise you will be clapping soon, hopefully. But if you were in Berlin or Zurich, you will gently knock on your chair. Comparisons allows us to investigate not just similitude and dissimilarities, but also the importance of context, of cultural difference, and importantly for history, of trajectories of evolution in time and space. Although considered a methodology of the social sciences, comparison turns out to be particularly suitable to artifacts. One can compare, for instance, two objects like these with a similar function in two different spaces. While early modern Europeans relied increasingly on elaborate coaches pulled by horses, well-off Asians used instead elaborate palanquins carried by servants. It's interesting, by the way, the ways in which palanquins existed also in Europe, and indeed Europeans call the palanquins in Asia sedan chairs, not palanquins. Similar functions or tasks could therefore be carried out in completely different ways. Comparison can also lead to surprising findings, as for instance the fact that whilst Europeans appreciated silver in the forms of ornate silverware and jewelry, Japanese consumers seem to have little use for silver for decoration, even though the country had abundant silver supplies. This type of comparisons allows us to consider attitudes to labor, the value of materials, the meaning of adornment, and so on. This is the case also when we consider different objects in one place. Comparison might be useful in finding out, for instance, about attitudes to sitting in the 18th century. Some of you might know, and it was referred earlier, that I was interested in footwear, but I was also interested in the history of walking in the 18th century. And this is why I became interested then in the history of sitting down. Something that you're all doing now, apart from me. We know that Europeans were keen to use chairs, something that was considered particularly exotic in most of Asia. This was a fact remarked upon in many diaries of European travelers in Asia who narrated the discomforts of sitting constantly on rugs and cushions. Yet this perspective is inverted when we consider two paintings produced in the early 1760s. This is probably the portrait of William Fullerton of Rosemount, an Englishman at the service of the English East India Company as a surgeon who in 1757 became the mayor of Calcutta. Although dressed in full uniform, he's shown seated on an embroidered floor spread while smoking a hookah. By comparison, this gouache shows instead an Indian man, possibly a gatekeeper in Fullerton's household. He wears a red dhoti and is also smoking, with a sword under his arm. By contrast with his European master, he is seated on a European-style chair on an empty terrace. These portraits were likely produced as part of a series that included another 6 men and women, Fullerton's servants and Indian mistresses, by an artist called Deep Chand. What is noteworthy here is the inversion of behavior and the acquisition of exoticism on both parties. Fullerton's becomes Indianized by the very act of sitting on carpets in native fashion, while his servants is westernized by sitting on a traditional 18th century English chair. The comparison between the two characters depicted in the different ways of sitting that they embody is a window for us to reflect on the meaning of exoticism and indigeneity, and on the importance of Western influences and Asian habits. All of this is done mostly through the presence of absence of objects that might appear to us relatively banal, a chair or a cushion. So let me go towards a conclusion. I have attempted to provide an overview of some of the ways in which historians approach global objects. A simple dichotomy between unique objects and global commodities is being followed by a categorization based on functional typologies. Neither, however, turn out to be sufficient to explain the complex and multi-layered meaning of connectivity in the early modern period. A methodological categorization shows instead the fact that historians use objects in different ways and narrate what we might define as the early modern phase of globalization through a variety of perspectives. Some consider connection from a specific point, either by showing the flux of objects and commodities reaching a specific place, or the variety of immaterial influences that shaped local production and consumption. By contrast, other scholars emphasize the dynamic aspect of connectivity and either follow objects and commodities moving to different places, often from a place of origin, or follow an object as it is materially changed in the process of being exchanged. These approaches in turn emphasize different aspects of early modern connection, ranging from ideas of cosmopolitanism and hybridity to vectors and direction of exchange in what is defined as an artifacts chain. Let me finish with an issue that I've sidelined so far. That is the issue of perception. what people made of such connections at the time. The oblong faience tile panel produced in the Netherlands between the late 1690s and 1730 is now on display at the Asia in Amsterdam exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. It shows a Chinese landscape, and indeed at the center of it, at the top of it, is the goddess Wan Jin that is sitting on a lotus flower and enveloped by a yellow sun. What we know is how this object came into being, essentially. This is the problem for us. So this is something that was produced in the Netherlands at the end of the 17th century, but clearly it incorporates quite different parts of the world in one object. For instance, we know that the top part, the goddess, might have come from a Chinese print available in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century and probably used as a source for earthenware decoration. A number of smaller scenes are depicted. In particular, one can single out the dark figures on the panel that are clearly South American, based on their clothing and regalia that is typical of the Amazon regions. We actually know they're based on illustration from Arnoldus Montanus' description of the America. And these are the original illustrations. Here, Asia and the Americas come together in what we might call a blending of motifs. Yet easy categorization might not explain it all. Montanus' portrayals of Latin America is in fact not very different from Dapper's description of Formosa, present-day Taiwan. The object shows an act of inventiveness, of construction of spaces that are not real, but reveal the ways in which contemporaries perceive such spaces and categorize them. The Delft artist's decision to make the figures darker, as observed by Carina Corrigan at the Peabody Essex, might be linked to the fact that porcelain was long thought to have been made from white cowrie shells, which were natural objects associated with Africa. It must be observed that in many cases these methodologies overlapped and intersect. However, their value lies in their ability to show how the very concept of connection created through material artifacts is far from monolithic, and this was the case in the early modern period as it is today. The early modern world was brought together by the exchange and trade of material artifacts, ranging from precious objects to trivial commodities. Yet historians, global art historians, historians of the decorative arts, and of course curators, are asked to make sense of the subtle processes at play in these connected worlds. Rather than emphasizing one story or one narrative, as might be the case, for instance, of one of the main paradigms in global history, the rise of the West or the power of colonialism, material culture allows us to look at the complexity, sometimes at the contrasted processes and dynamics that brought Europe in relation with other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. The floor is now open for some questions. Well, why don't I start? The terms of the lecture and the approach focused on what, if we think about this in economic historical terms, focused on consumption. Connectedness, global history is about the life of the object after it's produced. Is there a production history in which these same terms could appear?
Okay, I might be able to to respond from what I know best, that's to say the textile case, in which you have a lot of production that is quite specific in two ways. One is that is very specific to certain localities. So many parts of India in the early modern period produce a variety of textiles that you've seen earlier. And sometimes the difference between one village and another is significant, because very often they cater for what we might call today very different markets. So what is traded to Southeast Asia is very different from what is traded to Europe or what is traded to Africa. So that's one perspective, if you want. And of course, the other one is the other side of the same coin, to think about the ways in which you actually are doing this differentiation of products. So in this case, I'm really talking about commodities. So in terms of your production, how you are able to create products that you know will be sold. We know quite a lot in the case of products sold to Europe, and how Europeans were very active in sending instructions, in sending very often written instructions about what they wanted, light background for textiles rather than dark background, flowers that were smaller than what was actually sold, what was sent back. And the same kind of processes were surely at play also with trade with Southeast Asia, with China, and other parts of the world. So we know about these processes. Indeed, we have in this audience experts on these. So you will find that there is an articulation also from the point of view. If you use, for instance, the example of porcelain, this is where the differences in materials is very important. Porcelain, which my colleague Anna Herritzen and I wrote something together in which we compare and contrast the case of porcelain and cotton textiles, because on the one hand you might say porcelain and cotton textiles were surely in quantitative terms constituted the majority of what was traded in between Europe and Asia, for sure, in this period, but then behave very differently, because porcelain can be commodified, can be specifically changed to suit the tastes by going directly into the process. There is very little you can do later on apart from mounting porcelain, or in the case of porcelain by creating sets of porcelain. The same in many ways happen for textiles. You can create sets for beds, for instance. But with porcelain, really, when it goes into a kiln, you cannot add the armorial coats after it has been done. So there is a different kind of relationship between, if you want, the global possibility of trade and exchange and what is happening in terms of production, if you consider these two different types of global commodities.
Hi, that was really lovely. I have a question, though, about things that don't fit, the anomalies or things that didn't work out. And I'll confess I have a particular example in mind. There's a colleague of mine working on a paper sample book that was developed in the 18th century, but it was a substitute for paper using the plant conferva, but it never took off. And there was a lot of investment from the government and industry in trying to introduce this as a viable substitute for paper in the 18th century, but it just fizzled and died. So in your story about global things and this choreography between all of these different kinds of exchanges that you so wonderfully sketched out for us, what does the role of serendipity and failure play?
Okay. It's a interesting and difficult question. Indeed, it's a difficult question because the ways in which we tell stories is by following the successes rather than the failures. Mm-hmm. And this is partially due to the kind of evidence that we use. So the success might be a successful embassy, it might be a successful creation of a trade connection in which over the years sees the exchange of large quantities of stuff. But you're saying, what about the products, for instance, that don't work? I have a couple of examples for you. Mentioned earlier carpets. The English East India Company, in the very early years of trade, in the beginning of the 17th century, sees the potential of essentially replacing the traditional Turkish carpets with carpets produced in, especially in North India, and start importing carpets to Britain. And that's a total disaster, because they realized that they were very expensive. They cost about 25 to 30 pounds. That was quite a large amount of money. So they had miscalculating essentially the price target, you would say today. And so much so that, again, thinking about the time relationship, it takes years to find out that something is unsuccessful, because first of all you need to commission it, you need to send the instruction, you need to produce it, and then you need to send it back, and then it will not sell. The entire process really takes 5 years. And after 5 years you start seeing the correspondent start saying, please do not send us more carpets, no carpets please, they're very expensive. And that's one case. The other case that again is textile related is a case that nearly bankrupted the English East India Company, in which they had in the 1680s the idea of creating innovation. So innovation we always think is great, but it's also very risky. And what their idea was based was a very simple one that in long term turned out to be very successful. They realized that shirts were made of linen, but actually they could import shirts made of cotton directly from India, ready-made shirts. And so they did, importing 500,000 of them. Now, if you consider the population of England at the time was about 6 million, it was absolutely gigantic quantity. And that turned out to be a disaster again, because they could not sell. Consumers did not want those commodities, because shirts were made of linen. There hadn't been a kind of what I call a process of familiarization of the product in this case. And so eventually they tried to sell them to in North America, and they didn't sell. And they ended up, the last report we had, that they were in the Hudson Bay area, where they were trying to sell them for beavers, but again they didn't sell, so they were dumped there. That nearly bankrupted the company, because it was really a major investment. Originally I thought that the problem there was they were ready-made, and there was very little ready-made clothing in Europe at the time. But it turned out that the main problem was actually the material they were made of. So cotton was a perfectly feasible material for a petticoat, or indeed for wall decorations, but it was not. It had not yet become part of underwear, essentially, because that's what a shirt is in the 17th century. And therefore, if you want, is a story that reveals the failure. Does it reveal this connectivity? Possibly not, because it turns out that it reveals a different kind of connectivity of these objects across the world. So even in failure, you have a lot of processes. So it's then what I call the negative, the externality, would say an economist, that turn out to be a very good way to look at different kind of processes. But they're so much more difficult to find out in terms of the sources that we use.
Thank you.
In the back.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could relate how you see a different topology, that is the topology of empire in this situation. For example, you showed some pottery from Puebla. When one knows the economy of Nueva España and how it's evolving, more than likely, perhaps, that kind of pottery was something intra-empire, traded within Granada and other parts of the Spanish Empire. And I'm wondering how that impacts that kind of topology on the kind of examples you're showing here. Because connectivity, in a more global sense, is based on domination of silver, domination of spices, and the political power that derives from that just as a few examples. So I'm wondering how that kind of history interacts with what you're talking about.
Yes, that's an important point that you make, in the sense that what I have underlined really is what I call the long distance connection. But at the same time, you're totally right that you might then go and see what are the dynamics that might be within an empire. In this case, it might be the Spanish colonial empire. It might be within a specific area, so it's quite local. An example there might be that you might wish to consider, for instance, dyes is a very interesting example of this, that very often they come to characterize entire specific communities, and indeed the trade of, in the case of the Spanish Empire, becomes a very important trade. At the same time, you can tell a story that is, if you want, within that limit, that remit, and so it has been done by several of my colleagues. I've tried here to, if you want, to connect those stories with other forces. So the dyes, for instance, yes, you might have cochineal, but at the same time, I'm interested in the way in which cochineal then was used in Venice or Northern Europe, and then interacted with alternatives that might have been there in terms of other dyes that came from Asia. That's the kind of processes that I'm trying to pull together. But you're totally right that each of my stories here can also be told in a very different dimension. And in fact, I rely very much on that scholarship. It's not that once you're trying to go global, you can then ignore what goes on within specific empires. In fact, I had to rely, the building blocks are still within, I don't want to call them area studies, because they're not area studies. That's a kind of very present day vision of these, but comes from specific scholarships that are interested either in the Spanish Empire, or it might be the Ottoman Empire, it might be the Chinese Empire, and so on.
My question is about how to deal, for example, with the human component of this kind of a story that you are building, because many of these objects didn't travel by themselves. They were actually traveling with people that acted as intermediaries of interpreting, or sometimes like caretakers in the case of the animals that were, circulating around the world, or actually transmitting techniques and so on. And sometimes what I find is when we focus on inventories or in the study of the objects and the techniques and the materials and so on, that kind of human dimension gets a little bit written off. So how do you see that kind of element playing a part here?
Yes. Material culture in many ways is a great way to talk about human agency. But then it turns out that for the early modern period in particular, it's very challenging, in the sense that we very often don't know much about these objects. Their biographies don't include many people, at least people that we can name. So you can do it by generically saying this type of objects is something that I do with my students, for instance, by saying this type of objects, who would it be owned by, who could it be used by, who would have traded these objects, and so on. Rarely you can actually attribute it to specific individuals. There are other ways in which you can do that, in the sense you mentioned earlier, inventories. The case that I mentioned earlier, the exhibition here, was quite specific and quite peculiar in many ways, because you have someone who has a global life and you have an inventory. You don't have the objects, but you can actually put some objects next to it. So you create a juxtaposition in that case. You have other cases as well. For instance, recently I became very interested in costume books. Costume books are representation, two-dimensional representation of dress, that also wants to represent the global, an idea of globality. That's why I'm interested in it. And they very often represent not just the dress, but also the people in stereotypical ways. So instead of singling them out, you have stereotypes of people. And I'm interested, for instance, in thinking about what is the geography, in the ways in which actually these books create their own geography. So I cannot talk about the agency of individuals in this case, because I don't know any of these individuals. For my unique objects, you might have a bit more, because they were collected, they were part of a very famous collection sometimes, and therefore you might be able to add a lot to their biographies. I think we need to do more, and in many ways it's my problem as well, because I've written a book on cotton, which I decided not to use people, but to use objects instead without the people, to give prominence to the objects. So I made a conscious decision to do that. It might be that the next project will try to bring together people and objects much more. But as I said, for the pre-1800 period, it's actually quite difficult to do that.
I think we have time just for one more question. Aaron?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. My question builds on this in a way and takes us back to issues of consumption or reception or perception, as you framed it in your conclusion. And that is there, do we know, or what are the tools for tracking how much knowledge of the sources of these objects circulated with them? So that of the different, you gave us a sort of typology of the objects and their relationships globally. Might there be another set of categories that would be based on objects that circulate with specific knowledge of their sources versus objects that don't? Or are they different? Do they end up with different types of consumers? Those who have objects that signal foreignness, but other consumers have sort of a connoisseurial knowledge of the specificity of those foreign sources. So it's really a question of what knowledge circulates with the objects and how we can get access to that to understand the kind of specificity of value that might have been attributed to them in their own time.
Okay, you have a double question there, because on the one hand you're challenging the classification that is good, in the sense that it's only one of the many classifications. You can slice the cake as you want in many ways. So this was my own typology, in which I was trying to think about the coordinates of space mostly in terms of my classification criteria. So you might say, actually, I can create my own classification. And indeed you can, and thinking about specifically about the relationship between materiality and knowledge. Knowledge is a difficult word because, as you know, knowledge means, is it knowledge about the object itself, about its making? Is knowledge in terms of what I call the imagination of the specific area? So there are different types of knowledge associated to that. And as we know, this has been one of the questions that particularly history of science have been asking over the last 20, 30 years. So it's not a new question for global history. It's borrowed from the history of science. For me, as coming with a training in economic history, the issue of knowledge becomes slightly different because it is much more about information. It's much more about knowledge. As I said earlier, I talked about markets. Is much more about, if you want, about economic knowledge rather than material or technological or even knowledge in terms of practices of innovation. So I mentioned earlier issues substitution, something that might be a word used also by historians of science and technology. In the case of economic history, that has been quite an interesting debate because it was actually my colleague Maxime Berg that put forward the idea that substitution is done not by understanding the processes, but by understanding the materiality of the object. So that you receive a piece of cloth and you want to reproduce it, but what you reproduce is the final product, not the process, the original process done in India. And the same with porcelain, the same with lacquer. Turns out that I had to challenge that because in the case of cotton, it's actually there is a transfer of knowledge, of technologies from India to Europe. So I hope I have responded a bit to your question. But the point there, that what I found very interesting is that you should challenge the classification because depending on your point of view, you can classify in different ways. The entire paper was a bit of a provocation, if you want, and I started with the history of the world in 100 objects, because the exercise, I very much like the scale and intellectual remit of that kind of exercise. What I didn't like was the fact that it was a history that was exactly identical 100 times. It was done with the same kind of technique. What I'm trying to say here, you can produce very different types of histories. And I've just given one ways in which we might be able to do global history.
A very appropriate place to stop. We can all imagine other ways of telling global history, thinking about the way in which objects and lives interact. But we will have to do all of that on our own, informally, outside with some refreshment or later in the evening, after we thank our speaker, Giorgio Riello.